War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 29, the conflict in Ukraine. As if the Arab-Israeli conflict wasn't challenging enough, I guess I might as well discuss the other major ongoing conflict today, the one between Ukraine, with ample assistance from NATO countries, and Russia. But first, a midpoint podcast update. I have received numerous complaints, if one can call them that, of the brief nature of my podcast. So a little behind the scenes. Each podcast is researched to varying degrees depending on my personal knowledge or the age of my knowledge, and then a script is developed. This process takes several hours over a few days. Each script is around 2,300 words. Then recording and editing, which takes another hour or so, depending on how well or poorly written the script is. So I am simply unable to put out more than about 15 to 20 minutes each week and maintain any semblance of quality. Even if this was a full-time job, mentally it is exhausting as, even when I'm not researching, writing, or recording, I'm often thinking about the current or next podcast. I intend to do 1 year's worth of podcasts, or 52 episodes. After that, I'll relook at my audience, see if there is any audience growth, and determine the future after that. So again, please recommend the podcast to anyone you think would be interested. If I do continue, I hope to expand to interviews with experts in various fields for more in-depth conversations on such things as air-to-air combat, fires, naval combat, and special operations. These interviews would be the longer conversational type which dominate the podcast industry. Let's hope we get there. My thanks again to my subscribers, Brian, Ken, Paul, Dave, and Jeffrey, and my thanks to those who have submitted fan mail. Please share any recommendations you have for future topics. So on to this week's subject. Recently, Tucker Carlson interviewed Vladimir Putin. His first question was to the point: why did you think America would attack Russia? Putin asked for 30 seconds to give a quick point of history, and then for 20 minutes, Putin gave a lecture on the history of the Russian people. Carlson tried, fruitlessly, to drag Putin back to answering the initial question, but Putin pushed on. For the next 40 minutes, Putin lectured on talking about the history of Russian-American relations since the fall of the Soviet Union. Carlson was openly taken aback by the various historical points seen from an obviously Russian point of view. As with many Americans, even though Carlson has a degree in history, which Putin noted in the interview, Carlson seemed impatient with Putin answering a direct question on current events with a dissertation on history, both ancient and recent. Putin didn't lay out a justification for the current war in Ukraine directly. Rather, he initially laid a framework defining Ukraine, or previously known as the Ukraine, as a subset of Russia. Ukraine means roughly borderland in Russian. Calling the region the Ukraine references a time when it was a region of Russia and not an independent entity. But the real point and the bulk of the discussion was on American and by proxy Western actions after the fall of the Soviet Union, to which I was a direct witness as a young lieutenant stationed in Germany. The fall of the Soviet Union saw the disintegration of not just the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, of which both Russia and Ukraine were a part of. Czechoslovakia broke in two, the Czechs and Slovaks establishing their own republics quite amicably. Yugoslavia, an amalgam of several nations created after World War I, disintegrated. With Macedonia, borrowing the name but not the geography of the ancient Macedonians of Alexander the Great fame, Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia all breaking off into their more or less traditional borders, leaving Serbia, the traditional capital of Greater Yugoslavia, struggling to maintain control of a crumbling multi-ethnic state. I served as part of the UN Protective Force in Macedonia in 1995, guarding a peaceful border between the new Republic of Macedonia and Serbia. Later, in 1995, I went to Bosnia to control the Zone of Separation, or ZOS, between the Muslim parts of Bosnia and the Serbian Orthodox Christian part of Bosnia, known as Srpska. Later, the region of Kosovo, part of variously Serbia and the Ottoman Empire, but inhabited in various percentages by ethnic Albanians, declared independence from Serbia. The Serbs, who acquiesced to other separatist movements, decided to insist on its sovereignty, and NATO, dominated by the United States, took up the mantle of Kosovo's independence and launched airstrikes against Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. This was a pure strategic air power political dominance campaign designed to inflict economic damage on the Serbian government to force compliance to their diplomatic desires in Kosovo. It worked. The Russians, who, like the Serbs, were Christian Orthodox, impotently decried NATO's dominance, but to no effect. Kosovo was unilaterally declared independent in a move, while recognized by the United States, is still rejected by the majority of the UN General Assembly. So what does this have to do with Russia and Ukraine? When the Soviet Union dissolved into its various constituent republics, the United States, wishing to have influence in the new, smaller, yet remaining the largest geographic country on Earth, made several assurances to Russia that they would not provoke the weakened, yet still nuclear-armed state. Specifically, we stated, and did so 5 times, that we would not expand NATO eastward. So much for that. We also very publicly repudiated the entire basis of the UN and the concept of the Westphalian nation-state. The UN was designed to ensure direct conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, along with our various allies, would not occur. The UN did this by establishing in its charter that no one would interfere in the internal disputes of sovereign nations. The U.S. decided after 1991 that this principle no longer applied. Rather, ethnic self-determination, irrespective of established international boundaries, would determine our foreign policy. And so, otherwise sovereign nations were continually subdivided. Kosovo was not the only example. We carved out the nations of East Timor and South Sudan from their larger parent nations. We jumped head-on into civil wars in countless countries, most notably in Somalia. Regime change became our foreign policy in Iraq. Later, we developed a doctrine of responsibility to protect, or R2P, where American armed forces could be used in any country where any group was deemed under threat to not only protect the group, but overthrow the current government and install one to our preferred liking. We did what we wanted. And this goes back to an earlier time and an earlier war and one of my favorite authors, Thucydides, and his history of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was fought between Athens and Sparta, Sparta being the strongest power in the Peloponnesian Peninsula, now an island due to the canal splitting Greece at the isthmus. In 416 BC, the Athenians invaded the island of Melos and demanded tribute, which the Melians refused, and Athens laid siege to the island, which was inhabited by Dorian settlers, Spartans being of Dorian heritage as well, but Melos had remained neutral in the conflict. Side note, the Venus de Milo comes from Milos. Go figure. Eventually, Melos surrendered. The men were all executed and the women and children enslaved. In refusing the original ultimatum, the Melians argued, sensibly, that they were not part of the conflict between Athens and Sparta, and thus Athens had no need to conquer them. Athens replied that to refuse to take Melos would show weakness and embolden other conquered territories to revolt. Conquering Melos would demonstrate strength. The Melians said their honor demanded they refuse the Athenian demand, to which the Athenians replied, "You are too weak to expect honor." Finally, the Melians made an appeal to heaven, stating that their moral superiority would cause the gods to favor them, to which the Athenians replied, "The gods have ordained the strong to dominate the weak." To the Athenians, they could not understand the Melian refusal to accept the reality, and that there is no shame in submitting to a stronger enemy. Ultimately, the Melians refused the offer, dismissed the Athenian envoys, suffered the siege, and ultimately the destruction of their civilization. The Athenians then placed 500 colonists on the island, who themselves were expelled when Athens lost the war, and Sparta expelled the Athenian colonists and themselves annexed the island. So what does this have to do with what is happening in Ukraine? Regardless of the various diplomatic messaging we used, the United States, after the fall of the Soviet Union, exercised, most simply, the Melian dialogue of diplomacy, if such an adjective can fit. Simply put, the entire negotiation with Melos, from the Athenian perspective, can be summarized, and has been, as the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Or, more simply put, might makes right. Russia in the 1990s was free to complain at how the United States abandoned its promises about NATO expansion or ignored the sovereignty of fellow Orthodox Christian states, but they were incapable of stopping it. They suffered as they must. We were the Athenians, doing as we wanted as the sole superpower in the world, and no one could stop us. Regardless our justifications, to the victims of our martial supremacy, we were simply imposing our will because our strength allowed us to. Of the dozen or so nations in which we placed our thumb on the scale of history, did any pose threats to the United States? Did conquering them measurably increase our safety, security, or financial ledger? A strong argument can be made they didn't. Putin would certainly make that argument, and he has, many times. And as a nation, we ignored him. To the point of last week's podcast, the facts don't matter. It is only those who can impose their will who establish the truth, in the metaphorical sense. So now, finally, to the point of the current conflict in Ukraine. Ukraine is defending its territory within the international boundaries established. Russia is using armed forces to protect what it sees as ethnic Russians living in Ukrainian territory, who were promised self-determination and autonomy in the Minsk Accords. Both claims are equally as valid in the post-Cold War era as any other. But really what is happening is Russia is establishing dominance because it can, just as it did in Georgia in 2008 and in Crimea in 2014. You could spend 5 years in a doctorate program delving into the various histories, justifications, borders, and ethnicity of Ukraine and not have a full understanding. In the absence of the Westphalian sovereignty promised, and now abandoned by the UN Charter, it comes down to who is strongest, militarily, economically, diplomatically, and, to a certain degree, culturally. Strategically, Russia is stronger than Ukraine, both by pure population size as well as economically and militarily. Ukraine is entirely dependent upon Western support to maintain the current stalemate. Zelensky has openly stated as much. The recent attacks by U.S.-made ATACMS missiles by Ukraine into Russia serve no real operational or tactical purpose. Rather, the attacks are a strategic gambit to bait the Russians into an overreaction, inviting in NATO to take up arms directly in Ukraine's defense. It may work. The disputed Donbas region of Ukraine is of no significance to any other countries outside Russia and Ukraine. Yet the fighting in Ukraine is now a proxy fight between portions of NATO and Russia. If the objective is the maintenance of the Westphalian international order, the Russians will claim hypocrisy. Not that it matters at this point who claims what. I don't personally believe Putin is that invested in the safety and sovereignty of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. By his own words, he largely rejects the concept of an independent Ukrainian ethnicity, seeing them as they were once described, Little Russians. Rather, in my opinion, much of his actions are a petulant but unsurprising response to Americans' Millian diplomacy of the past 35 years. But the relative peace of the Cold War was dependent upon deterrence, and deterrence rests solely on a nation possessing a legitimate threat, which Russia did not have in the 90s outside its nuclear arsenal. Was the world a more stable and peaceful place during that period? You can argue either way, but, as with so many things at the grand strategy level, what is true or false is irrelevant. What is believed or not believed is far more important. From Putin's perspective, the United States acted as a bully when given complete control of the international order, so now Ukraine will suffer, as it must. I laboriously and admittedly largely futilely attempted to, in 15 minutes, sum up the 30-year war, mostly to describe the catastrophic results of an international situation bereft of the order given under the auspices of the Westphalian nation-state model. The West, and the United States in particular, did much to undermine that order after we won the Cold War. And this is the result. It is, much like Millian diplomacy, inherently neither good nor bad. It simply is. And on that note, the time has come to talk more of Thucydides, Alcibiades, with an all-too brief overview of the Peloponnesian War, which we will discuss next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.